This is Chapter 5 of how Moons of Darsalon was made, the video game that has so many mechanics at the same time that it was a nightmare to make them all work together without conflicts. In the previous chapters, we saw how I created the pixelated system and how it works in conjunction with the 2D dynamic lighting system. Today, we will see how terrain destruction and creation work. How do indie games make destructible terrain? They use tiles, square terrain blocks. Each block is a unit, usually the size of the main character, and that block can exist or not exist when destroyed. Some have states prior to their destruction where they show cracks before finally disappearing. This is fine. It gives a more organic touch, but it still feels somewhat artificial because the appearance and collisions of the terrain cannot escape their tile nature. How does Moons of Darsalon do it? In Moons of Darsalon, the grid for terrain destruction or creation is the size of pixels, not tile-based. This makes it feel much more natural, besides making the gameplay much richer since we are talking about ramps of all kinds of angles, rough vertical walls, holes of all kinds of shapes that interact with the game's physics, etc. It's not exactly like Noita, but we could say it's closer to Noita than to Dome Keeper. Yeah, but how does it achieve this? The entire level is a giant sprite. When I was developing Moons of Darsalon, Unity had a maximum texture size of 4096 by 4096 pixels. These are quite large dimensions considering the size of the characters. In fact, almost all levels are smaller than that. This giant sprite texture is filled with a smaller texture with the terrain drawing, typically 128 by 128, and is filled at runtime. This way, the texture is not stored on disk, so the levels take up less disk space. Thus, all the pixels of all the terrain of the entire level are filled with color. But, and here is where the magic comes in, the alpha of those pixels is in a separate texture where the silhouette of the terrain is defined. The sprite shader is a shader that uses two textures, the one with the rocks drawn and the texture that is only alpha. This alpha texture is converted into a byte array called alpha data and compressed in a format that I created specifically for this case, considering that the alpha can only have two values, 1 or 0. Given that the terrain usually has blocks of identical values in sequence, the alpha data can be compressed significantly, thus saving unnecessary disk space. This terrain destruction system is part of an asset called Destructible 2D by Carlos Wilkes, which I purchased from the asset store at the time. Okay, that's about the pixels, but what about the colliders? Destructible 2D is capable of generating colliders from the alpha texture of a sprite so that the collider perfectly defines the contours of that sprite. You can choose the complexity, precision of the collider, and it is advisable to leave it at an intermediate level to speed up real-time calculation and to prevent the creation of overly complex shapes that could affect physics behavior. Still, collider calculations are CPU intensive. So Carlos provides a system to divide large colliders into internal cells. This way, if a piece of the ground needs to be redefined, we only have to rebuild the colliders of the affected cell. This is the best case scenario because it may be that the affected piece of ground spans 2, 3, or even 4 cells if we are at the borders of 2 cells or at the corner of 1, which would probably affect all 4 colliders. When this happened, a CPU spike occurred, which I solved by distributing each cell reconstruction across frames. To manage this, I created what I call the expensive task manager, which I don't just use for this. It's capable of handling various heavy tasks. Regarding the terrain, when several cells need to be rebuilt, the reconstructor doesn't do it immediately, but rather adds a task per cell. The expensive task manager processes only one task per frame, thus avoiding CPU overload, and there's no noticeable impact during gameplay. Let's take a closer look at this. A destructive element, such as a laser shot, hits the terrain and using a small destruction texture, which is a roughly irregular circle, there are several variations to make the destruction more organic, overlays the destruction texture onto the terrain's alpha texture and decides which pixels to erase. Changing the pixels of an alpha texture from 1 to 0 is not very costly and is done immediately. But then the colliders need to be rebuilt and the modified texture sent to the GPU. I divided each of these tasks and sent them to the expensive task manager independently to be processed when the task manager deems appropriate, typically each in a different frame. Destructible 2D handled all of this at the moment of collision. The tasks for the expensive task manager are my modification to avoid overloading the CPU by adding 1, 2, 3, or 4 regenerative tasks. Each task has the index of which cell needs to be regenerated, and they are executed each in a different frame. The pixels disappear before the ground collider is regenerated, but it happens so quickly that it is not noticeable. Okay, but what about constructing terrain? It's the same but in reverse. Destructible 2D is designed solely for destruction, but in a sprite like the terrain of Moons of Darsalon, where all the pixels have the color information previously filled and never deleted, it's simple. Instead of setting the values to 0 in the alpha texture, we set them to 1, and magically, terrain appears before our eyes. Similarly, the function to regenerate terrain is called with the affected cells and will work the same way to generate terrain without any modification, since this function does not know whether the new alpha pixels are set to 1 or 0. It just reconstructs the affected cells' colliders, and that's it. Okay, but with just this, the aesthetic result is not very pleasing. The terrain texture looks cut out too simply and appears very flat. The cosmetic effects I applied to the terrain can be seen in the previous chapter if you haven't checked it out yet. I'll leave the link in the description. And that's it for Chapter 5 of how Moons of Darsalon was made. In the next chapter, I'll talk about the character controller and its animation manager, which provides more natural animations by working independently with each part of the body. Subscribe if you don't want to miss it.